This episode of 312 is brought to you by Thompson Hine Podcasts and their series Environmental LAWS.
Every industry and workplace felt the strain caused by the pandemic. For some, it was the strain of working from home, or layoffs, or keeping workers busy and productive. For others, it was the stress on your supply chain, manufacturing changeover to essential products like PPE, or balancing the health and safety of your essential workers. Regardless of the strains you and your company felt, both personally and professionally, an area we have observed as further suffering is environmental health and safety compliance. As manufacturing and the economy continue to recover, it is important that we address compliance head-on, identify where compliance might have slipped, and ensure we have a path forward to build in compliance and resiliency. In this podcast, we're going to approach three key subjects. First, the enforcement discretion policies that both OSHA and EPA had early in the pandemic, and what that means now as we're emerging from the pandemic. Areas of compliance that we've identified as suffering because of the pandemic. And then finally, when should you consider disclosing these compliance gaps versus just finding them and fixing them? I'm Jackie Baxley, the Environmental Health and Safety Practice Leader at HRP. And I'm pleased to be joined by my friend and colleague, Nathan Hunt from Thompson Hine. Nathan, would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself and your company?
Sure. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate it. As Jackie said, I'm Nathan Hunt. I'm an EHS attorney at Thompson Hine. Thompson Hine's one of the top 200 law firms in the country. We have Ohio offices in Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, and Cincinnati. We also have offices in Chicago, New York City, and Atlanta and Washington, D.C. And my practice primarily is environmental on all levels, compliance, litigation, transactional, and I also do OSHA compliance and enforcement law.
And Nathan and I have had the opportunity to work together, over several years, whether it's working with compliance evaluations, audits, and disclosures. And so I thought, just from my years of working with Nathan, that he could bring some great insight today for this podcast. And also to return the favor, because we got to do a podcast together on Thompson Hine's podcast. So looking forward to doing this one with you today.
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah, so let's dive right in. So first, the enforcement discretion. So EPA and OSHA both recognize that the pandemic was just an unprecedented situation, and as a result, that compliance was going to be a challenge. So this was not new information for anybody. We knew that because of social distancing, because of travel restrictions, because of the need for individuals to work from home, whether it's for personal health reasons or family reasons, and just all the other myriad of pandemic, concerns, compliance was going to be an issue. Essential vendors were not going to be able to get to your locations. Essential employees that might have always been the ones that did the training or did the inspections might not be able to get to the workplace. And so because of this, OSHA and EPA, both early in the pandemic, started releasing enforcement discretion guidance so that employers could use that guidance to help triage the situations that they were dealing with. Additionally, protecting the workplace from COVID largely fell on EH&S personnel. EH&S personnel are pretty much the trickle down. If nobody else is going to take care of it at a plant, it's normally EH&S or facilities that's going to handle it. So as such, the EH&S personnel, not only were dealing with the burdens of trying to ensure compliance during a pandemic, but also the burdens of ensuring the health and safety of essential workers during the pandemic. So all of this led to the situation we recognize, which is compliance suffered during the pandemic. So there were two key enforcement memos that were issued, one by EPA And OSHA actually released several memos, but one that I want to talk about is the good faith efforts. So Nathan, do you want to maybe lead us off on the EPA Enforcement Discretion memo, and then I'll share some details on the health and safety one?
Absolutely. So the EPA policy was interesting. As you said, we're in this unprecedented situation where in almost every state, people are being required to stay home. They are locked down and they are working from home, and only essential personnel are showing up at particular manufacturing sites and other environmental sites subject to environmental regulation. And EPA's response to this was in March of 2020, right when the pandemic really hit, was to issue this policy document that they would provide enforcement. They would exercise enforcement discretion, assuming you'd met certain conditions. And interesting thing I found about this was immediately right out of the gate how, and not to make it a political thing, but blue states immediately reacted and were like, this is ridiculous. We're not going to roll back our regulatory schemes like US EPA is doing. And you had red states saying, we're going to do what US EPA is saying, we're going to do the same thing, blah, blah, blah. And it was very unprecedented because this stuff was hitting the news and it was getting picked up in the news, and it became this story that US EPA was essentially allowing people to not comply with law. And they're basically saying, if you have a permit and it has limits or it has conditions, don't worry about it. During the pandemic, you don't have to worry about it. And so, of course, there was outrage in many quarters. And you may recall, EPA actually issued a press release where they basically said, we have to issue this press release because there is so much misinformation about what our policy we issued says. And our policy says nothing about you do not need to comply with your requirements. It says, if you fail to comply, we may exercise discretion under very particular circumstances to allow you to not seek enforcement against you or seek penalties, et cetera. So in other words, it was almost like the audit policy in many respects, which we'll talk about a little bit later, where it wasn't a free pass. You still potentially would be subject to enforcement, maybe no penalties, but it was very discretionary. And it was designed, of course, for the very reason of EPA didn't really know what to expect. No one knew what to expect. The EHS people managing their particular sites didn't know what to expect. So it was fascinating observing it from 30,000 feet, seeing what was happening. But a lot of it, as we talked about, we don't have to get into details because, frankly, it's no longer in existence. It was very short-lived. It only lasted from March through the summer. And then when, at least initially, the pandemic seemed to be winding down in the late summer and the early fall, I think EPA said, okay, things are returning to normal. We don't need this anymore. We've got a handle on it. But a lot of it was record keeping based. Basically, if you were going to be in non-compliance, you better generate, internal memos or other records to show what you tried to do to stay in compliance, how you remedied the situation as best you could so that you have a defensible position when this came around. And two things I'll mention that were also very interesting is I don't recall a single one of my clients using the policy. No one ever called me and said, hey, Nathan, we're not going to be in compliance. What should we do? But they did do this. They said, Nathan, in our consent decree or in our permit, there's a force majeure clause, an act of God, basically. The pandemic is an act of God. We may not be able to comply. What should we do? And so what we did was we created this draft letter that we sent to agencies. And it was just sort of a laundry list of things where our client would say, look, we may not be able to do certain things. We're giving you notice of a force majeure, which was required under the permits, which was required under the consent orders. And a lot of times the agencies would respond and basically say, we appreciate that, do your best. It's sort of a different way, if you will, of getting at this enforcement discretion. And one other thing I guess I would mention too is what I saw several times is enforcement action that was taken during this period. In other words, a client of mine would get a letter from the agency saying, we're issuing this NOV to you for something maybe that happened before the pandemic really hit. But in every letter, they would say, let us know if because of COVID, you need more time or COVID contributed to why these violations happened, et cetera. And definitely people were taking advantage of that opportunity. I mean, in every case, we were taking as much time as we could get in multiple enforcement actions. COVID was a factor because we had folks who weren't at the facilities and we had to explain we weren't able to keep a certain record, et cetera. So it was interesting. It was, again, not directly the enforcement discretion policy that EPA issued, but it was sort of an offshoot of it, if you will.
Yeah, and something key that you mentioned that I picked up on is you've got to have that documentation of what you did to attempt to comply. And I know as our conversation progresses, we're going to be talking about auditing, and that's going to be key because so many regulatory programs out there require that you maintain documentation for maybe 3 years. So if there were, 9 weeks of weekly inspections that are not in your records, then if I'm doing an audit, I would expect to see in your file where those 9 weeks of weekly inspections should be, that documentation that during this time the audits were missed because of the pandemic, and we are enacting either this EPA documented information guidance under the discretion policy, or if there was a state equivalent to serve as that record moving forward. I'd expect to see some documentation. So 3 years from now, when I'm asking for that record, don't tell me, oh yeah, that was discretion period. Show me, show me that's not an afterthought. That was actually conscious during the time.
And one thing I would mention real quick is just because the discretion policy is no longer in existence, I mean, we're still in COVID. And if you are subject to an enforcement action or an information request, I mean, you should factor whether COVID, even if you're not asked by the agency whether COVID was a factor in the issue at hand, whether it is noncompliance or something else. Was COVID a factor? And factor it in and include that in your response. Because I think we're getting in this mindset now where people are getting vaccinated and we're going to start living with COVID more than we were before, and that's all true. But it's still impacting folks, manufacturing facilities, our clients. They need to continue to think about it in that respect.
Especially since the EPA memo sunsetted or expired on August the 31st, which was long before our worst peak. Our worst peak was, early 2021, late 2020. So yeah, even if the policy had expired, still show your good faith efforts. And that term good faith efforts, I think, is a good segue to the next enforcement discretion policy. And that was from OSHA. Now, OSHA had numerous memos throughout the pandemic, whether it was guidance or discretion related to a specific program, such as respiratory protection, or other guidance along the lines of how to ensure worker health and safety during COVID, or how to record or monitor work-related illnesses associated with COVID. So numerous memos were issued by OSHA over the last 12 to 18 months. But the one that I want to highlight is the one that was published on April the 16th of 2020. So, hey, which it happens to be April the 16th today that we're recording this. So this memo is a year old today. And that one remains in effect today. And so unlike the environmental one that has technically expired, this OSHA one still remains in effect. And I call this the good faith efforts memo. But it essentially, again, OSHA recognized because of the myriad of issues caused by COVID, compliance was going to be an issue. We had worker shortages. We had travel restrictions. We had social distancing restrictions. We had facilities that flat out had to close, or other restrictions such as sheltering in place or what have you. So with that in mind, OSHA said they will have this, OSHA will assess an employer's good faith efforts to comply with the standards that require some type of annual or recurring condition, such as, an audit under the process safety management system, or a recurring review of your Lockout Tag Out program where you have to do those annual audits, or annual training requirements such as, the annual 8-hour HAZWOPER refresher training or some other annual training under one of the numerous programs, as well as the routine assessment requirements. Again, getting back to the process safety management, not only do you have, to do audits on a recurring schedule, but you have to, reassess your process on a recurring system as well. So there's lots of calendar due dates when it comes to occupational safety and health regulations. So what OSHA said is, where compliance is not possible, ensure employees are not exposed to hazards from tasks, processes, or equipment for which they were not prepared or trained to deal with those hazards. Explore other options thoroughly, whether that could be, all right, could we do this training through Teams, or could we do this training through some online program? So you had to explore all your other options as thoroughly as possible. Consider any interim alternative controls, maybe temporary administrative controls, maybe temporary engineering controls, and then make sure that you schedule whatever that task was as soon as possible. So as soon as you were able to return to some degree of normalcy, when maybe the conditions in your state or your location started to get better, you started to have more, more travel, more interactions, make sure that you got it scheduled just as soon as possible, which I think is important to note. It wasn't saying skip it altogether. It was saying you still need to do it, and it's okay if it's late, as long as you still do it. So, taking a look at this, and I think to relate it to what you were just sharing with us, Nathan, on EPA's policy, is where the employer cannot demonstrate their efforts to comply, a citation may still be issued. And so we really need to be able to demonstrate the good faith efforts. So again, that documentation to the file. This was the issue. This is why it was caused by COVID. And then this is what we did to ensure the health and safety of our employees during that time. For example, maybe you couldn't do training, but maybe you could send an email out to everybody. Hey, read these 3 things just as a reminder or a refresher of what we need to do in the meantime. Or, hey, we're going to, we can't do this, process safety management audit at this point in time, but process safety management still applies. So ensure you're still following the following things. So there were other, you just need to demonstrate what did you do to ensure the health and safety of your employees during this time. And then make a note of when you came back into compliance. So maybe you should have done your process hazard assessment for a covered process under process safety management by June the 1st of 2020, but it wasn't possible because of COVID. So when did you do it? When do you have it scheduled? And make sure that you do that soon as possible. So that one, interesting to note, is still in effect. And, we are still in the pandemic. I've gotten one of my 2 vaccines. I haven't gotten my second shot yet. So we are still living with COVID. So that is still, a tool, if you will, in the toolbox of EH&S professionals as they're continuing to triage and balance compliance.
One thing I would add to that is actually 2 things. One would be, I feel terrible that I didn't bring a cake to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the policy, and I feel like I missed like my wife's anniversary or something here. So this is awful. But all joking aside. You said it's still in effect. It is still in effect. The interesting thing we need to keep in mind is when the Biden administration came in, one of the first things they did was sign an executive order regarding what OSHA needs to do about COVID. And one of the things in that executive order was it needs to assess whether an emergency temporary COVID standard should be adopted by OSHA. Right now, obviously, we're just using existing OSHA standards to deal with COVID, the respiratory standard, infectious disease standard, PPE standard, et cetera. So not shockingly, OSHA looked at that and decided, yes, we do need an emergency standard. They have not issued that standard yet, but it's expected any day. And we don't need to get into necessarily the details of it, but it'll be interesting to see how the standard lives with this good faith policy, because at this point, there is now going to be a standard you need to meet. And will the good faith policy still be applied the same way? Or will the good faith policy be phased out as the standard is implemented, basically saying you've had enough time to get the proper PPE or to adopt those training mechanisms, alternative training mechanisms you referenced, like doing Zoom calls, et cetera. So just something to be on the alert for out there, because we are probably days away from that standard hitting, which is going to be emergency temporary standard. But the word on the street is it will be made permanent, because COVID likely is to be permanent, just like the flu, just like the common cold. COVID's not going away. So this COVID standard may not be going away either.
Right. Yeah. And we've only had guidance to this point relative to OSHA and COVID in the workplace. So and really the general duty clause is the only thing that OSHA's kind of had in its toolbox. And with this temporary standard, as you were saying, emergency temporary standard, OSHA's going to have more tools in their toolbox, to ensure health and safety as well. So good points. Good points. So COVID aside, what were some of the common compliance lapses that we've seen out there? And, not surprisingly, maybe, is that the common compliance gaps that we've seen during this last, 12, 13 months are the same ones that we saw pre-COVID. They're the same regulatory programs that I think people always struggle with, either because of their misunderstanding of the standards or just the challenging nature of applying these standards in the workplace. So there's kind of 6 key areas, if you will, where we've seen compliance gaps. Training, whether that's environmental training or health and safety training requirements. Sampling. So if there's a sampling requirement on a permit, we've seen gaps there, which also just brings us into permit compliance as a whole. So whether it's routine monitoring, routine inspections, maybe routine maintenance, we've seen gaps in permit compliance. Again, that could be an air permit, that could be a wastewater permit, that could be a stormwater permit. But just permit compliance as a whole has suffered. And then process safety management programs under OSHA, and what I like to call their cousin under the EPA, the risk management program. Both of those have struggled because, those are 2, I would say, of our most complex EH&S regulatory programs, process safety management and risk management programs. So in the best of times, compliance, is a struggle for workplaces. But then secondly, there's a lot of routine requirements in these programs, whether it's an audit, whether it's an assessment, whether it's training, or whether it's just that routine maintenance associated with both of these standards. Employers have struggled with compliance through those programs. Both of those programs require a lot of administration on site. So if you don't have the person there to double check that everything is actually working the way it should, then it could be an issue. And then Lockout Tag Out. Lockout Tag Out, I would say, is probably a regulatory program that a lot of people struggle with, because it is it has a wide scope on in any workplace. But the area that we've seen struggle the most is the annual audits under Lockout Tag Out, because you have to audit somebody's application and understanding, as well as the quality of the equipment-specific lockout tagout procedures. So that's a challenge during COVID, because you are physically auditing somebody implementing that procedure. And so that requires contact. You can do it from 6 feet, absolutely, but it requires physically being there. Or, you could use some of the technology that's been used, throughout the pandemic, such as videos and GoPros and things of that nature. But that's one that we see people misunderstanding the requirement during the best of times. And so you add the challenge of the pandemic. it's really a lot of folks have missed that obligation. And then lastly, industrial hygiene. And so industrial hygiene, ensuring that, employees are not exposed to contaminants above permissible exposure limits, requires monitoring. And so normally that requires maybe a contractor coming on site, affixing the badges and the pumps to employees, monitoring them over a period of time, sending that sample to a lab and saying you're above or below those limits. So that requires a lot of moving parts. One, the ability to have a visitor in your facility, two, the close contact that is associated with equipping those badges and those pumps to individuals. And three, when you're doing that assessment, you want those assessments to be representative of normal operations. And there's probably a lot of people out there listening that would say, we have not had normal operations for 12 to 13 months. So how can you do an assessment when you're not assessing a normal situation because things are just always in flux? Maybe you're going to run that process line today, but maybe there was a case of COVID and that entire process line is all in quarantine. So you had the vendor scheduled to come in today to do the assessment, and guess what? There's nothing to assess. And so there's just been struggles with all the moving parts that goes into industrial hygiene monitoring. Nathan, have y'all seen anything in working with your clients that kind of further support some of what we're seeing, or are you seeing anything else?
Well, you said normal operations. We haven't had that in a while. And what I have seen is obviously the specific areas you reference. But what I'm also seeing is the issue of personnel. So when you talk about gaps, I would call them maybe personnel gaps. So because of COVID, for example, some businesses had to lay off people. And maybe that person was an EHS specialist, or they just hired a new EHS individual, manager for a facility, for example. Or there's just been natural turnover during COVID where someone retires, EHS personnel, new EHS personnel comes in. But because you don't have normal operations, that normal transition from one individual to another isn't happening. And I'm seeing more and more enforcement cases where a regulatory gap has been created, where a permit application wasn't submitted, or records were not being maintained because when that individual retired or was let go and the new individual came on, there wasn't an onboarding process that was ready to cope with the irregularities, if you will, of normal operations under COVID. And so this, to me, everything you said and what I just described, it's imperative, I think, that any medium-sized to large-size regulated facility, regulated entity, they need to do a voluntary compliance audit. They really need to step back and look at these gaps, try and identify where these gaps are. Because we do this all the time. You and I, we have companies that we work with that do them every year. And the thing that I find amazing is these companies that have the best EHS programs, in the world, arguably, who do audits every year, with reputable companies, and they take it very seriously. Their top manufacturing facilities will still sometimes have 20, 30, 40 findings. And that's under the best of circumstances. So imagine a scenario where you've had abnormal operations for now a year, where we've talked about all these gaps that are being identified, and a lot of them are coming up via enforcement. I can't imagine even the best of companies what their findings are going to look like. Because the other thing to keep in mind is those companies we were talking about that do this regularly, lots of them deferred their audits for all of 2020. So they haven't even done audits. So they're going to have lots of additional findings because of just normal things that happen, plus adding COVID irregularities onto it. Think about the companies that rarely do audits. I mean, they're going to be worse. So I have to recommend you do, a voluntary compliance audit. And I really, if you're going to do it and do it right, you probably should involve an attorney. You should have that done under attorney-client privilege. Have your attorney retain the consulting firm who's going to do the work so that you can at least create the defense of the attorney-client privilege regarding the report that's generated. You may not want to use that if you got into enforcement or you wanted to voluntarily disclose the findings, et cetera. But, it's better to have established that defense at the outset than to go into it, particularly in this situation where there's so much uncertainty about what you're going to find. Even if you consider yourself to be the elite of sort of the EHS world, you're going to find more than you normally would, and you should factor that in.
And something that I think is interesting to note, we've been talking about abnormal operations and a lot of the struggles, assuming that you didn't have staff, available to maintain certain programs. Another I guess effect of COVID that we've seen is, I could even say for HRP as well, going into the pandemic, we were crazy busy. And I heard the phrase once, have you ever tried to change the tires on a car when it's going 100 miles an hour? And so when you're crazy busy, it's hard for you to pause and have those process improvements or kind of focus, in the business as opposed to on the business. And so some companies have taken this pause, if you will, to build in some process improvements or some efficiencies into their operations, which is wonderful. But as you're talking about audits and disclosures and things of that nature, was there a management of change that was exercised in some of those process improvements or building improvements that you exercised during these abnormal operations? Or could you have maybe failed to get a necessary air permit or, failed to update a critical management system element, such as Lockout Tag Out, because you just pulled in this new piece of equipment or you had these process improvements? So I think an audit, if somebody's out there like, oh no, we had our staff, we were good. We actually really focused on a lot of improvements during this time. Well, that too might be a reason why you want to do this audit. What did your management of change or lack of management of change program not pick up on, during this time? So Nathan, let's say we've got companies out there and they're like, yeah, you know what? That's a good idea. We need to pause. We need to see where are we now and where should we be relative to compliance? What should somebody do when they find those gaps? And really what I'm leading you in here is to disclose or not to disclose. And I know that's something that sometimes when I'm doing an audit on behalf of a client and there's not an attorney involved, either in-house counsel or somebody like you is not involved, sometimes we have findings where we're like, you might want to get counsel involved here. What calculus should somebody apply, relative to when to disclose a finding versus not?
So when I look at this, I divide it into OSHA noncompliance and environmental noncompliance. OSHA to me is very straightforward. You're never going to disclose anything because there's no reason to. There's no benefit to you to disclosing it to the regulatory authorities. There's no audit policy. There is no other than the COVID discretionary policy we talked about, but just day to day, there's no guidance there under which you're going to get a penalty break something for voluntarily disclosing something. Now, that's not to say, for example, if you have a reporting duty, for example, fatality, someone loses, there's amputation, you've got a hospitalization, or you have record keeping or reporting obligations that are required to be submitted to OSHA or reported to OSHA. Obviously, you need to do those things. And if you do them late, well, you still need to do them. You're not just going to say, well, I missed it, so I'm not going to do it. You're going to do it. So OSHA, again, straightforward as far as I'm concerned. Environmental, a little more art. It's a little more art than science. It just depends on, what's your risk tolerance, what's the actual violation? Do you have a lot of violations versus one violation? Is the one violation an extreme violation? You need a Title V air permit and you don't have one, versus you find some minor compliance issue. We failed to have one record for our 3 years of RCRA hazardous waste storage area inspections, and we missed one weekly inspection. Okay, you're probably not going to self-disclose that. So it's more art than science, but a couple of things that I look to is, one, unlike OSHA, EPA and most states have some form of either an audit policy or an audit privilege law under which if you voluntarily disclose something, a violation, you may still receive a notice of violation, but you most likely will not receive a penalty. So that's the benefit of disclosing it. Two, you have this, EPA also has a new owner policy, which COVID or not comes in great. If you are acquiring a company or a facility and you conduct an audit within a certain time before or after that acquisition and you identify findings, you can disclose those at least to the US EPA under its new owner policy, audit policy, if you will. And I've used that many, many times in the past, and I have found it to be a great policy because essentially US EPA's approach to it is, thank you for letting us know. Tell us when you have everything fixed. We may come and inspect you, but we probably won't. And by the way, you won't get dinged for anything that happened because of your predecessor. So that's another area to consider, when to disclose, not to disclose. I think generally speaking, Epcra violations are an area where folks should go ahead and disclose because the audit policy itself has been streamlined for that in many respects. Oftentimes, I think this is accurate, that the most often self-disclosed violations are Epcra violations, i.e. you failed to submit a Form R report. You failed to submit a Form R report that was complete. Maybe you missed a chemical, et cetera. So these are often very administrative violations. And I think EPA, frankly, got kind of sick of receiving these formal letters saying, hey, we violated this. And they created an electronic reporting system that was specifically geared towards Epcra. And if you fell into those types of violations I just described, sort of routine Form R violations, those just go straight to a thank you for reporting. We have certified you are in compliance going forward. And so I would always say disclose those. You're going to reap the benefit of no penalty, and you're going to also update in the process your Form R reporting so that it is up to date and accurate, et cetera. We talked a little bit about this idea of the types of violations and the number of violations, et cetera. I guess the way I look at it is if you have one significant or a couple significant violations, you should probably disclose. If you have numerous smaller violations, but cumulatively they add up to a significant violation because you're going to have compounding penalties and other things, you might as well go ahead and disclose those as well. The real area where the middle ground is when you're somewhere between those two areas. And that's where I'm talking about. You have to what's your risk tolerance? What's the likelihood you're going to be inspected and this issue is going to be discovered, et cetera. But one question I always ask myself is the violation something where we were required to submit something or maintain a record? Okay, so because those are the things where EPA shows up, inspects your facility, and they say, I want to see all your inspection records, and you haven't inspected something for 3 years. Well, I'd rather disclose that when I learn about it so that I don't get dinged for those 3 years. Or if I was required to submit, for example, like air monitoring reports or wastewater discharge monitoring reports to an agency. Well, they're going to figure that out eventually. So you might want to try to disclose, even if the policy technically says you can't disclose things like that, you might as well try to disclose them under the policy. So those are some things to consider. We don't need to dive into these policies, but they're all generally the same. They give you a time period within which you discover the violation to report it voluntarily to the state or federal agency. When you're thinking about these things, you also should think about, have I used the policy before for a very similar type of violation? Because there may be a prohibition against you doing that within a certain time period. So if you reported at facility A that you didn't have a Title V permit, and then a year passes, facility B, you do your voluntary compliance audit there, and you realize it doesn't have a Title V permit, you may be barred from using the audit policy within a certain time period, say 3 to 5 years, to report that. So sometimes people will factor that in and say, well, this violation's relatively small in this particular area, and let's hold our chip back until we might want to use it on something bigger that is similar down the road as opposed to this relatively minor issue. And the last thing I'll say about the audit policy is EPA just issued, I think within the last month or two, a new frequently asked question guidance document where it went through the EPA audit, US EPA audit policy, and sort of revised some of the answers to the typical questions people have about eligibility, what kind of violations can I report, things of that nature. And it's not much different from what they've had before, but I think it's a little more concise and it's helpful. And I recommend it to anyone who is familiar with the audit policy or not familiar, just to get a better idea of what the universe of the audit policy looks like and what types of violations the agency discusses in that policy.
And then what about, in general, I know there could be nuances from state to state, but in general, is there a certain amount of time that you have to disclose to the agency? So it seems like there's a lot of things that should be taken in consideration. Can you disclose 3 months later, or is it more timely than that?
Yeah, it depends. It's all over the map. US EPA is 21 days from the date of discovery. So it's a pretty tight window, and a lot of states follow that as well. A lot of other states, however, just have generic language like timely, notify us, or within a reasonable period of time, etc. There are some other states too that have maybe double the 21 days. So they're all over the map, and that's why you really need to, one of the things I caution people about is they just think about the audit policy and they think about US EPA. And so you have to really think, who am I disclosing to? In some cases, you may just disclose to the state. So you better be familiar with their audit policy and what their timing requirements are. Some cases, you're going to voluntarily disclose to US EPA, and some you're going to voluntarily disclose to both. So these are considerations from a timing perspective you have to deal with. I'll give you a quick example. Illinois has a audit disclosure policy that has a length longer than US EPA. And we just had to disclose some air violations that have a federal component and a state component. So it was a little tricky because while our Illinois disclosures were technically not due for maybe another 20 days after US EPA's disclosure, we had to just go ahead and rush everything, if you will, because we had to meet that 21-day deadline for US EPA. So the way I look at it is I've never seen one that's less than 21 days. So always just use 21 days as sort of your floor and then see what else you have going on.
So I think that's an important timing mechanism for everybody to understand. So if you're thinking, yes, I'm going to do an audit, see where I am, where do I need to be? So it's not going to be 21 days from when you had that violation. It's going to be 21 days from when you discovered you had that violation. So schedule your audits, and in that scheduling, kind of have that mark on your calendar that if there's anything you want to disclose from this audit, you're going to want to engage your in-house legal counsel, somebody like Nathan, in that decision mechanism, pretty timely from when you have that audit. So lots of considerations. We're still living with COVID. We're likely going to be living with COVID for quite some time. And so whether we're dealing with the challenges of the pandemic or whether we're dealing with just normal challenges that any workplace might have, such as natural attrition, being bought or sold, with other companies, or just the other myriad of routine challenges that we have. When you're looking at compliance, as I tell my son, you're going to mess up, and that's fine. But mess up, fess up, and move on. So as that applies to compliance, realize you're going to have compliance challenges in the best of time. So that's the mess up part. Fess up, have an audit. Identify what the challenges were. Identify what your gaps are. And maybe in that fess up part, not only is it an internal fess up where you identify that you had a compliance gap and what are you going to do to move forward? What are you going to do to make sure that doesn't happen again? Maybe in that fess up part, you want to include your federal or state environmental agencies to get some of those disclosure protections, and then move on. Make sure you build resiliency into your environmental health and safety programs, whether that's through a management system whether that's through just building in duplication, such as having more than one person that can file a certain report, having more than one person that can do some essential inspections, and just build in some of that resiliency so that you can be prepared for the next challenge, whatever that challenge might be.
Well, thanks, Jackie. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate it. It was an interesting conversation, and I think you have a great career in the t-shirt business with mess up, fess up, and move on. So if this EHS racket doesn't work out for you, just jump into the t-shirt market.
Well, if my son was listening to this podcast, I'm sure he'd roll his eyes. But I don't think 14-year-old boys is the demographic we're going for. So I think we're safe in that one.
This episode of 312 is brought to you by the Thompson Hine podcast and their series, Environmental LAWS.
Court is now in session. Mr. Simmons, you may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Your Honor. If it pleases the court, I'd like to bring your attention to Thompson Hine podcasts and their series, Environmental LAWS. Laws explores current topics in environmental health and safety laws in the United States from the perspectives of Thompson Hine environmental attorneys, the regulated community, regulators, and the occasional special guest. It covers a wide range of issues in the areas of land, air, water, and safety laws, LAWS, if it pleases the court, Your Honor, and will be of special interest to any company that faces environmental health and safety issues. Objection, Your Honor. This man is attempting to plug a completely different podcast in the middle of his own podcast.
Overruled. I'm going to allow it. Mr. Simmons, proceed with your podcast, but on the stipulation that everyone listening has to go subscribe to Thompson Hine podcast and the Environmental LAWS podcast as soon as they're done with this episode.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, as I was saying,
Your Honor,
Thompson
this
Hine.
is a highly irregular.
Order! Order in the court!
Just
So
may
help
be-
me, there
may
will
just
be
be a
order in this
simple- Your
courtroom.
Honor.
So help me, I will have order in this courtroom.
This episode of 312 is brought to you by HRP Training. HRP can get you the training and certifications you need through our online learning management system, highly interactive virtual sessions, and in-person training courses. Starting April 29th and running until the end of May, you'll find a weekly series of free webinars, all on the theme of post-pandemic resilience. Topics include assessing your compliance gaps, EH&S training, industrial hygiene, Lockout Tag Out, and risk management programs and process safety management. Go to hrpassociates.com/training to learn more. Hey everyone, Tom Simmons here for the Play Hard section of 312. Jackie and Nathan are with us once again, and this time we are joined by HRP's Southeast Regional Manager, Sean Malin. Sean, say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
And our theme for this podcast episode is post-pandemic resilience. So I want to know how all of you are personally staying resilient, how you've stayed resilient during this time, and how you're going to carry that forward. Jackie, you want to start us off here?
Yeah, so, if not killing your family members counts as being resilient, I think the Baxleys have fared pretty well. So I have a 14-year-old son, a husband of about 16, 17 years, and a dog that is less than 2 years old. And we've, the family is still together. I'd say we're a little stronger. We have learned to go to our corners and when to get together and when to ignore each other. So, personally, I've always been a walker. I love walking the neighborhood. I'm not somebody you're ever going to see in a gym, but you'll see me walking miles and miles in the neighborhood. So I've maintained my personal sanity by either walking or working in the yard. And then something that our family has ended up doing, because there's only so much time you can spend with people and actually have something to talk about, we've been playing board games at dinner every night. And so that's been something that's been fun, is each night we're at dinner, we're playing a board game. Sometimes it's Yahtzee. But most nights it is Settlers of Catan that we play. And that way we don't have to continually think about what are we going to say to these people that we've been stuck with for 13 months.
What is that game, Jackie? Settlers of what? What is that?
Yeah, Settlers of Catan.
It's great.
It is. Now, I'm a gaming family, right? We're always playing cards. We're always playing some type of board game. That's just my family, extended family as well. But Settlers of Catan, to me, is one of the best all-time board games ever.
It gets heated, though.
Man.
I made some real enemies playing that game, like Monopoly levels of animosity. I don't think he's still forgiven me yet.
You can be really spiteful and malicious.
Oh, yeah.
And we have the backsley version of Settlers of Catan, which means we've kind of made our own house rules over the years. So it's, it can get pretty hairy.
Nathan, how about you?
Well, before I get to that, I have to say I find it hilarious because I had never played that game before until about 2 months ago when my adult daughter's friend brought it over. And I had probably had a couple beers and I was trying to figure the rules out. Loved the game. Have no idea how I came in like third place out of 4 people, but I'm looking forward to playing it again. For me, the resiliency thing was all about trying to stick to my routines as best I could. And so I'm one of those people, I was very lucky with respect to the lockdowns and the pandemic generally, because I have an adult son who doesn't live with me, but he lives right down the street. So he's out of the house. And I have an older daughter who also goes to college. And so she's most of the time out of the house. And my youngest daughter is in college. She's a freshman now. She's in the house, but she sort of just lives in her room. So you don't get into too many conflicts with her. So generally speaking, we didn't have that problem like a lot of people had where you had everybody in the house and, school and all of that stress. I was also able to go to the office the entire year. I've never worked from home a single day. So to me, it was all about, get up, go to work every day, stick to my workout routine, stick to just the same routines my wife and I would stick to. And once things began opening up again, to the degree we could, we folded some of our older routines into our lifestyle, going to, our favorite little pub down the street kind of thing, or, we have a place up in Michigan that we can go to that, we don't have to go anywhere except to that place. So we were able to incorporate those types of things. And, for us, I think it went pretty well. We didn't, when I hear people talk about having school-age kids in particular, I have a lot of empathy for them because, I don't know how we would have done it if we were trying to, school our children, go to work, and, live cramped up in our little house together.
Yeah, I guess for us, I have some similarities to Nathan. I have a 5-minute commute. And not a lot of people were in the office. We have several thousand square feet, and so a lot of people were working remotely. And so I'd use that to my advantage. Actually, that's not even true. I'm lying to you guys. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I worked at home for like the first 3 months. And I have an 8-year-old who was home e-learning at that point in time and a 3-year-old. And my wife let me know very constructively that I shout when I get on the phone. And she was very tired of listening, A, to me shout, B, to the content with which I was shouting about, which was constant and mundane probably at that point in time. And I basically got kicked out of the house, actually. It was a family decision that we could not work from home. And then, everybody got into the whole issue of bandwidth with the kids e-learning, right? Jackie, I know you had some issues with that as well. So being that my commute was so short and there wasn't anybody in the office anyhow, that was probably a big piece of the puzzle, Tom, as far as the resiliency on the home front, removing me from the chaotic equation at home. But early on, it was rough. Kudos to my wife. It was rough with a 3-year-old and then trying to do second grade on the e-learning. And, we went through spells of, we're never going to send our kid back to school. And then the next day it was, if this kid doesn't go back to school, if the COVID doesn't kill us, we're going to kill each other kind of thing. So we were up and down and all over the place on that. So we were able down here in South Carolina, we got kids back to school right before the holidays and all that kind of jazz. So things picked up a little bit. But, on the gaming front, I don't know. We pretty much hunkered out. I'm not much of a game person, much to my wife's chagrin. Her family is huge games people. They're way too competitive for me. I am very competitive as it is, and my wife is equally as competitive. We did find a game called Hive. Has anybody ever played Hive? It's like this.
Nope.
They're these little. I believe they're hexagons, not octagons, but it's like a bug game. And how could I describe it? It's not really rummy, but you get a spider, you got to protect the bee. There's a queen bee. It's verbally this is going to be disastrous. But look it up. Hive is a great game. There's a lot of strategy in it, and a lot of cool things. So if you're looking for something to do, I would check that too. And I'll still keep looking for this Conquest of El Capitan or whatever the heck you guys are talking about.
Well, you know what? Just send Tammy over to my house because we're always yeah. So
she will take you up on that.
In my family, spoons is a contact sport, so the more competitive, the better.
For me, working from home was a huge benefit because I get to work in a space that is kind of completely my own. I get to control that whole environment. So coming back into the office, everything was like turned up to 11. Everybody, any typing on any keyboard, it's like it's inside it's like they're typing on the bones in my ear. I could hear the heartbeats of the people sitting next to me. So resiliency for me
they're
took
breathing.
the form of having the baseline level compassion and empathy to be around other people. And to do that, I kind of implemented the meditation and mindfulness practices that I'd decided to make a sincere engagement with over the course of working from home and kind of bring that into the space of taking 5 minutes to sit in my car every morning before I went into the office and just put myself in a positive space where I could interact with people instead of letting them drive me crazy for doing nothing wrong.
Man, Tom, that's heavy.
I don't know. I think
Seems like
Tom might be a superhero, actually. You should go to the doctor and get checked out. I mean, if you can hear people's heartbeats, that's the first sign that you might be a superhero.
Or a vampire.
Or a vampire.
I get it, though. I have difficulty working in really crowded spaces. So, I mean, this is going to be interesting, right? We have everybody coming back-ish to the office, regardless of the state that you work in. Nathan, I don't know if you guys have people coming back into the office yet or what Ohio or local ordinances, what's going on with there. But, here in our Greenville office, Jackie and I are in the same office. And it's picked up a little bit over the last couple of weeks. For the most part, it was just three folks, including myself for a long time. And then we've had some folks kind of trickle back more consistently over the last couple of weeks. And so I think with people getting vaccinated and things like that, I think there's a lot more comfort level with getting back to it.
So I don't know about y'all, but we've just purchased tickets for a concert that my family and I we go to every year. Here's a plug for the Albino the Albino Skunk Music Festival. Look it up. I did not make that up. The Albino Skunk Music Festival. They hold it every fall and spring of every year. And my husband and I and son, we've always gone. And obviously it's been canceled, here recently. But they are doing this. Spring Skunk is gonna happen. So we just bought our tickets. We camp out at the music festival. It's a great event. But my husband and I were talking last night about I haven't been around that many people in forever. It's going to be weird. It's an outdoor music festival. There's plenty of space to spread out. They're limiting the number of tickets they sell. By that time, I'll be fully vaccinated. My husband's already fully vaccinated. And so, I feel comfortable with the protocols. It's just going to be weird being around that many people because I don't think, I've not been around crowds at all unless you count the grocery store. So it's going to be, I just wonder how much it's going to take just to get used to being in those settings and situations again, because we've been isolated for so long to varying degrees.
Yeah, here so I'm in our Dayton, Ohio office, and we're in a suburban location, and there weren't many people. It was sort of like Sean's experience. There for a long time, there were very few people here. At most, maybe a third of the people would come in. Now, I would say we have about 40 attorneys, and I'd say about 35 to 30 come in every day. We still have a staff cycle going where the staff sort of work every other day. They work at home, then they come in, because back in the fall and the winter, across the country, of course, COVID was ramping up. And so that was one of the measures that was put in place to try and keep the number of people in the office down. But they've just never taken that away yet. So I'm not sure if we're just going to keep doing that, or maybe that'll be sort of a legacy of COVID. But your point's an interesting one, Jackie. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about that, and his wife generally works from home anyway, and she has a little bit of anxiety, et cetera, and she's gotten pretty used to COVID. And, she kind of likes the staying at home and everything. And I was saying to him, boy, I just wonder how many people out there are going to have trouble sort of transitioning back. It could be an issue. One way to do it is so my family and I, we're going to Wyoming in June for a trip. And since Wyoming has about as many people as Dayton, Ohio, and it's about 4 times the size of Ohio, probably will be able to spread out pretty well there. We won't have those issues. But I've definitely been in a few restaurants and bars where I've thought, boy, there's a lot of people in here. So doesn't bother me too much, but I haven't been that big, what you're talking about, that outdoor arena or setting or a big, sports event where you're surrounded by, thousands upon thousands of people. So I'm interested just as a sort of a passive observer to see what happens.
Yeah, I've always been a person that I probably had a larger radius of personal space in my own mind that was either granted to me by the people around me or not, So it'll definitely be interesting, Jackie, to see how many people. So an albino skunk, is that an inverse or is it an
Yeah, we got to come back to
skunk?
that.
Or is it like, is it a white skunk with a black stripe?
So I'd have to go to the website to get the official story. But if I remember correctly, the first, event that is now known as the Albino Skunk Music Festival, their first event, they saw 2, I think, albino skunks walking through the venue. And so it thus therefore became the Albino Skunk Music Festival. So it's in Greer, South Carolina. I would say it has historically been bluegrass, but it's really kind of kicked it up a notch in the most recent years. This year, one of my all-time favorite bands that I actually discovered at Albino Skunk Music Festival is coming back in May. So I'm super excited for War and Treaty. If you have never listened to the War and Treaty, give yourself a break, give yourself a reward, and go find them on YouTube. They are absolutely phenomenal. It's a husband and wife team, absolutely incredible group, War and Treaty. So I discovered War and Treaty at this music festival. I discovered Shiny Ribs at this music festival. I don't know if y'all have ever listened to Shiny Ribs. I don't know what Shiny Ribs' real name is, but he used to be the lead singer, I think, for the Gourds, maybe.
Yeah.
It's got some super shows. It's a really small venue, too, so not thousands of people, more like hundreds of people. And what's been really fun is we first started going when my son was in first grade, and it's small. And so they actually have a little kiddie area. So your kids kind of get to run around in a very safe space. While their parents are, having a beer and listening to some good music. And so there's this whole little kiddie land area. So it's actually, as far as the music festivals, circuit, it's a tame one. It's a very tame, family friendly, much smaller one, but just a great way for you to kind of catch some shows.
So for the record, the Skunk is all white, according to the website. just to close the book on that one.
And I think the festival owes you a little bit of money, Jackie, because that was one heck of a plug.
I know. Maybe so. Maybe so. So, Tom, maybe we can get some shared marketing with
Definitely. Got to get a tie in there.
Festival.
A free camping space. Don't you guys you have a camper? You used to tent it and then you bought a camper. But didn't the camper roll out of your driveway or something tragic? What happened? Tell us that story.
If the camper rolled out of the driveway, I was not privy to that information. So unless my husband shared that with you, and I did not know that story. So
maybe
we have a pop-up.
Maybe I made that up.
So
obviously.
yeah, we used to tent camp, and then I turned 40, and I don't sleep on the ground anymore. When we bought the pop-up, the person that we bought the pop-up from, they said, he's like, I don't know why we sell pop-ups. We don't make money on pop-ups. He's like, I guess the reason why we sell pop-ups is because people get sick of the pop-ups and then they come and trade them in for a real RV. And so we're pretty close to doing that because, it's funny, the effort that goes into pitching a tent is nothing, right? And then the efforts that goes into, popping up a camper is really not that much either. But the ability just to kind of pull in and park and plug in, yeah, I'm just the older I'm getting, I see the value in the full RV.
Creature comforts.
Yep.
So, what's everybody drinking? I just came from Dunkies, so I had a nice coffee that I pounded. Now, do you guys have Dunkin' Donuts out around there, or is that just the Northeast?
We're still located in America, Tom, so we do have Dunkin' Donuts down there.
I heard they don't have them out west.
Maybe not.
So I've heard.
We do have Dunkin's. Although if you're talking donuts in the South, they're gonna say Krispy Kreme before Dunkin' Donuts. But if you're talking coffee, I would say Dunkin' Donuts has a pretty good coffee. I'm drinking some high quality H2O because
nice.
I'm not off the clock yet. I actually have some mom duties later today, taking a uniform back to the school and doing little things like that. But what I have waiting for me when I do get home and get off the clock is there's a local brewery in Greenville called Birds Fly South. Sean, I don't know if you've ever been to Birds Fly South.
Yeah, for sure.
But Birds Fly South is a local brewery here. And they're kind of old style farmhouse brew, and they do a lot of different sours, and I'm a big fan of the sours, and so I have bird brains in my refrigerator. That sounds like if somebody just popped in and said she has bird brains in her refrigerator. Bird brains is one of their sours that I've got waiting for me at the house.
I'm shocked and sorry to say that I don't know if we have Dunkin' Donuts around where I live here in Ohio. Yeah, it's so weird because I could probably rattle off about 4 Starbucks and a couple Krispy Kremes. And my brother lives in the Boston area. And so when we drive out there, we see a gazillion Dunkin' Donuts once you hit, New York State pretty much. But I gotta think we have Dunkin' Donuts around here, but I gotta be honest, I can't recall where one is. I am drinking the finest Keurig light brew coffee that's in our little coffee center. I have no idea what brand it is. I have no idea what the name of it is. I just know it has a little orange stripe on it, and that's the one I get instead of the dark roast every time I get coffee. So when I get home, as we have mentioned a few times, I do have a bar. I'm very proud of my bar. Sean will appreciate the fact that it's Steeler themed. We're both big Steelers fans.
Yep.
And I have a ridiculous bounty of choices. Anywhere on the spectrum you want to go, beers on tap, beers in the fridge, bourbons, whiskeys, scotch, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't have a specific choice in mind, but something will happen.
Something will happen. I have a combination of the two of them, Tom. I have Greenville's finest Rewa water in a really gross, crusted over coffee cup. poorly rinsed. So I have a combination. It mainly, I guess, what that results in is like the coffee you get in the lobby of a hotel when you're staying there. So it's kind of like this weird. I also have a soccer game to attend tonight, and also, we got started at 3:00, so I was very hesitant. I put a lot of thought into whether or not Jackie and Nathan were going to roll in with beers or not on a Tuesday. So it looks like I chose wisely. Be that guy. But in regards to Nathan's bar, it is phenomenal. He has a lot of memorabilia there, and I didn't want to commandeer this podcast to talk about the draft, the upcoming NFL draft. So maybe we can take that offline, Nathan. But
yeah, I'll go for it. I mean, I have nothing to add to that conversation.
Where is the draft? Yeah, where is the draft this year?
I'm assuming
I believe it's
virtual.
I believe
no,
it's
in
Cleveland. No,
it's
it's in Cleveland this year.
Yeah.
It's going to be full. They're expecting thousands of people.
Really? All right, cool. So I guess real quickly, Nathan, are you feeling running back? Because that's the consensus. That's the money. That's where the whole money's going.
I've seen that. I've seen the talk there. I feel like it's going to be an offensive lineman, or it's going to be some strange trade up to get a quarterback that it's going to be a spur of the moment thing. If they see a certain individual drop, they're going to say, we might as well just go for it now and go after somebody. But I don't think they're going to go running back. I think that's more smoke and mirrors. Because there's just so many running backs you can get cheaper, right? You can get one in the second, third round. I just can't see him going first round running back. But now that I've said it, I will be wrong.
Yeah.
So it will be running back first round.
Yeah. I've gone through several iterations of this. It would be very Steelers to draft a lineman, especially in a draft. Sorry again, Tom, for taking over this, but there's like a phenomenal amount of, this is supposed to be like a offensive line rich draft, right? So you don't have to take your number one pick on that position. But that would be, the Steelers would totally do that and have done that. I don't see the quarterback thing. I don't know. I know that they were really giving a hard look to Ohio's Justin Fields, Ohio State's, right? I don't see them doing that. I'm kind of hoping, selfishly, I think the right pick is Najee Harris. I don't know that he'll be available. And so I'm kind of like, half of me is waiting for Etienne from Clemson to get onto the Steelers, because that would be kind of cool to watch him on Sundays for me personally.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting here looking at Sean, and this is a podcast, so y'all can't see what I see. I realize that. But I'm sitting here looking at Sean, and he's got his professional team's backdrop with, some artwork. I can see his Clemson diploma. If you were to mirror, if you were to look at what Sean is looking at right now, not only just our faces, but you would be looking at a wall of nothing but yellow and black Pittsburgh memorabilia on the other wall. So if he could just do like a panoramic of his room, you'd see Penguins, you'd see Steelers.
That's right.
What am I missing? Some Pirates.
There not a whole lot of room for pirate stuff, but I actually have, my mother went to the World Series in 1960, which is when the last time the Pirates won a World Series. No, that's not true. But they beat the Yankees in 7 games with a walk-off home run. Like, that was I don't know if that was the first series, but that's the one that old-timers will say, you're standing in your backyard, 3-2 count, 2 outs, bottom of the 9th, home run to win the World Series, right? Like that gratuitous thing. And my mother, when she moved down to South Carolina a couple years ago when we had our first kid, she had a whole bunch of stuff from that game. And she called me and she's like, I'm going to throw all this pirate stuff away. Do you want it? And I'm like, oh my God, are you kidding me? You're going to throw that away? Because it's got like Roberto Clemente's in the photograph. He's like a baby in it. And then I picked up the programs there and just looking through some of the advertisements from the 1960s. And so I got that all framed up. But that is the only piece of Pirates history that is on that wall due to the barren wasteland of winning. But again, Pittsburgh people were spoiled with the Penguins and the Steelers for sure. So it's hard to complain about it.
Yeah, I was going to say there's not much recent Pirates accomplishments to be putting up on a wall anywhere.
No, there's no new faces up there.
So Nathan, what's your connection with Pittsburgh? Just a fan of the Steelers, or is that where you're from? Because I know you as an Ohio guy.
Yeah, I am an Ohio guy. I've lived most of my life here, so not to go deep down the rabbit hole, but I'm actually a West Virginia guy. So my entire family's from West Virginia. My mom grew up in West Virginia. My dad grew up in West Virginia. All of my aunts and uncles generally have lived in West Virginia. My grandparents all lived in West Virginia. And my dad grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, where WVU is, West Virginia University. My mom went to West Virginia University, met my dad there. If you know the geography, it's about an hour away from Pittsburgh. So if you live in Morgantown, you're generally a Steelers fan or a Redskins fan. And then my parents, after they graduated, moved to Pittsburgh. So we lived in Pittsburgh for a while. I was born in Pittsburgh. And then I departed quickly thereafter as a young child. But it's sort of like, someone who's born in the United States as a U.S. citizen. So I was born into Pittsburgh Steeler fandom. So I have the right to claim it, I think, under some constitution somewhere. I'm not sure where that is.
No, I agree.
But I'm pretty sure I have that right. So, yeah, we were always, my dad was a big Steelers fan and big Steelers fans growing up. I had one of those when I was a little kid. I could still remember it. I loved it. It was basically like a Letterman's jacket, but it was Steelers. It had like gold sleeves, and then it had the black, middle part with the Steelers emblem. And I still see pictures of that jacket when I'm like 5 years old, and I'm like, man, I want that jacket. That is a cool jacket.
Find one and frame it for your bar, right?
That's what I should do. My wife, I converted her to be a Steelers fan, and so she's a big fan now. And football is a big part of our lives. It's interesting because I always loved football, but when I got older, when I actually graduated from law school, so that was 20 years ago, football became a huge part of our lives. We would go to Steelers games every year, physically go to the games, and then now that we have this bar, like I said, my son's a huge Steelers fan, so he lives right down the street, and we're like that family that every Sunday, he comes over at about 11:30, and we all watch football. My wife, him, me, or whoever's around, we watch football pretty much all day. I mean, it's not unusual for us to essentially take a break for dinner and then watch the evening game. So we're into it. We love it, and it's one of those things. You guys play games, we watch football. That's sort of our thing.
That's cool.
Nathan, thanks so much for joining us. Sean, Jackie, thanks for being here as well. And we will see you all on the next episode.
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. This episode of 312 was hosted by Jackie Baxley with production assistance from me, Tom Simmons, and technical assistance from Everett Anderson. Subscribe to 312 for new episodes on the last Wednesday of every month. If you liked what you heard, rate us 5 stars. It really helps us out. Check out our YouTube channel every Wednesday for a new video. Thanks once again for joining us, and stay safe out there.